Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up on a morning 700 years ago. The year is 1320, somewhere in rural England. There is no alarm clock to wake you, no electric light to guide you. The sun has not yet risen, but you can already hear the stirring of animals in the darkness. The air smells of smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something pungent and organic that you cannot quite identify. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a simple collection of straw covered with rough wool. It scratches your skin. You are cold, even though it is summer. This is not a camping trip. This is not a Renaissance fair. This is your life, and it will be your life every single day until you die, which, if you are lucky, might be in your 40s. More likely, it will be much sooner. We have been taught to think of the Middle Ages in certain ways. Knights in shining armor, grand cathedrals, feasts in torch-lit halls. These images are not entirely false, but they represent only a tiny fraction of medieval reality, and they applied to only a tiny fraction of medieval people. For the overwhelming majority, perhaps 85% of the population, life in the Middle Ages was nothing like the romantic visions we have inherited from folklore and film. It was hard, dirty, painful, and short. Tonight, we are going to walk through a single day in medieval times. Not as a lord in a castle, not as a merchant in a prosperous town, but as an ordinary person, a peasant, a villain, someone bound to the land and the lord who owned it. We will see what you ate, how you worked, how you washed, what you believed, how you were governed, and what would have killed you. We will discover, step by step, why you almost certainly would not have lasted a single day. This is not a story of chivalry and romance. It is a story of survival. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Chapter 1. The Morning. Waking in Darkness. You wake before dawn because you must. There are no windows in your home, or if there are, they are simply holes in the wall covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters to keep out the worst of the cold and rain. The interior is dark, smoky, and close. You share this single room with your entire family, your spouse, your children, perhaps your aging parents. Sometimes you also share it with your animals. A pig or a few chickens might be kept inside during the winter months for warmth and protection. Their smell mingles with the smell of unwashed bodies, old food, and the acrid smoke from the hearth that never fully vents through the small hole in the roof. You rise from your bed of straw. There is no mattress, no pillow, no sheets. Straw was cheap and plentiful, and it was replaced when it became too fouled or infested with lice and fleas. Yes, lice and fleas were a constant part of life. You had them. Your children had them. Everyone you knew had them. Delousing was a social activity. People would sit together and pick lice from each other's hair and clothing. There was no shame in it. It was simply part of existence. The first task of the morning, even before eating, was to tend to the fire. If the fire in the hearth had gone out overnight, it was a serious problem. Starting a new fire required striking flint against steel to create sparks, which were then carefully nurtured into flame using dry tinder. This process could take many frustrating minutes. If you could not start a fire, you could not cook, you could not warm yourself, and you could not boil water, a critical step in making it safer to drink. Some families kept their fires burning continuously for months, banking the coals at night and reviving them in the morning. A household that let its fire die was considered careless. Once the fire was going, you would begin the morning routine. Contrary to what many people believe, medieval peasants did wash themselves, just not in the way we do today. There was no indoor plumbing, no running water, no soap in the modern sense. Instead, you would wash your hands and face in cold water from a basin. If you were lucky, you might warm a little water over the fire first. You would scrub your hands with ash or sand to remove the worst of the grime. Your teeth were cleaned, if they were cleaned at all, by rubbing them with a small twig, often hazel, which had been frayed at the end. Bathing the entire body was a much rarer event. For most peasants, a full bath might happen a few times a year, often in connection with major life events or religious festivals. When it did happen, it involved filling a large wooden tub with water heated over the fire, a laborious and time-consuming process. Many families bathed together or in sequence to save the effort. The church encouraged cleanliness to a degree, particularly before attending Mass. But the reality was that hauling water, heating it, and having a private space to bathe were luxuries that most people could not afford regularly. This does not mean that medieval people were indifferent to hygiene. Many washed their hands and faces every day. They understood that filth could lead to illness, even if they did not understand the mechanisms by which this happened. But compared to modern standards, they were, by necessity, far less clean. Your clothing was simple and coarse. If you were a man, you might wear a tunic made of wool or linen that reached to your knees, with woolen hose, essentially long socks, and leather shoes that were often little more than shaped pieces of hide tied to your feet. If you were a woman, you would wear a long woolen dress, perhaps with an apron and a linen cap to cover your hair. These garments were sewn by hand and were precious. Most people owned only one set of clothing for work and one for special occasions, if they were fortunate. Clothes were repaired endlessly, patched and repatched until they were more patch than original fabric. Washing clothes was a major undertaking. It involved soaking them in water, often in a river or stream, beating them with wooden paddles to loosen the dirt, and sometimes soaking them in lye, a caustic substance made from wood ash, to break down grease and grime. Then the clothes had to be rinsed, wrung out, and hung to dry. The entire process could take most of a day. Given this effort, clothes were washed infrequently, perhaps once every few weeks or even less often for outer garments. After washing your face and dressing, you would say your morning prayers. Religion was not a separate compartment of life in the Middle Ages. It was woven into every moment. You began the day by crossing yourself and murmuring a prayer, asking for God's protection and blessing. This was not optional. To fail to pray, to fail to show deference to God and the Church, was to risk not only social disapproval, but also eternal damnation. The fear of hell was very real and very immediate. Sermons reminded you constantly that sin led to suffering, both in this life and the next. The line between the natural and the supernatural was thin and porous. Demons could cause illness. Angels could intervene in your daily life. The devil was always watching for an opportunity to lead you astray. Finally, with the fire burning, your face washed, your clothes on, and your prayers said, you were ready to face the day. But first, you needed to eat, or try to. Chapter 2. Breakfast, the struggle for daily bread. In the Middle Ages, breakfast as we know it barely existed for the common people. The first meal of the day, if there was one, was modest and often consisted of leftovers from the previous evening. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, but not the soft white bread we know today. For peasants, bread was dense, heavy, and coarse, often made from a mixture of grains: rye, barley, oats, or even peas and beans ground into flour when wheat was scarce or too expensive. Wheat bread was reserved for the wealthy. The bread you ate was dark brown, gritty with bits of chaff and husk, and sometimes contaminated with fungi or mold. One particularly dangerous mold, ergot, grew on rye and could cause a disease known as St. Anthony's fire, which led to convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, and death. You might spread your bread with a bit of lard or drippings if you had them, or dip it in pottage, a thick stew that was the mainstay of the medieval peasant diet. Pottage was made by boiling together whatever vegetables, grains, and legumes were available. Cabbage, leeks, onions, beans, peas, barley, oats. If you were fortunate, you might add a small piece of salted pork or bacon, but meat was a rarity for most people. Livestock were too valuable to be slaughtered for food, except on special occasions. They provided labor, milk, eggs, and wool. Resources far more useful to a struggling household than a single meal of meat. Dairy products played a more regular role in the diet. Cheese, especially, was important because it could be preserved and stored. The cheeses made by peasants were simple and fresh, often described as green cheeses, because they were young and had not aged. Milk was consumed, though it spoiled quickly and was more often turned into cheese or butter. Eggs were another valuable source of protein when hens were laying. You washed down your breakfast with ale. Not the strong, hoppy beer we drink today, but a weak, mildly alcoholic beverage made from fermented barley, oats, or wheat. Ale was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated with animal waste and disease. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, killed many harmful bacteria, though medieval people did not understand why. They simply knew that ale kept better than water and made them feel less ill. Even children drank ale, albeit a weaker version. Everyone, from infants to the elderly, consumed alcohol daily. A gallon of ale per day per person was not unusual, although the alcohol content was quite low, usually around 2 to 3%. What did medieval peasants not eat? Sugar, for one. It was rare and expensive, imported from the Middle East and used primarily for medicinal purposes or by the very wealthy. Most people had never tasted refined sugar in their lives. Sweetness came from honey if you were lucky, or from fruits during their brief seasons. There were no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, no chocolate, no coffee, no tea. All of these foods were unknown in medieval Europe. The tomato and potato, staples of modern European cuisine, would not arrive from the Americas until the 16th century. Medieval meals were monotonous. You ate the same things day after day, week after week, year after year, with only seasonal variations. In late summer and autumn, you might enjoy fresh vegetables and fruits. In late winter and early spring, food became scarce, and you lived on stored grains, dried beans, and whatever salted or smoked meat you had managed to preserve. Starvation was a real and recurring threat. Crop failures, whether from bad weather, pests, or disease, meant famine. And famine meant death. Nutritional deficiencies were common. Most people did not get enough protein, vitamins, or minerals. Rickets, scurvy, anemia, and stunted growth were widespread. The upper classes, who consumed more meat, suffered from their own dietary problems, including gout and scurvy caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. There was no understanding of balanced nutrition. Food was evaluated based on taste, availability, and a complex system of beliefs inherited from ancient Greek medicine, which classified foods as hot or cold, wet or dry, and prescribed them accordingly. Physicians believed that a person's health depended on balancing these qualities, a theory that persisted throughout the Middle Ages despite having no basis in reality. Meals were eaten without forks, which were not in common use. You ate with your hands, using your fingers to tear bread and scoop food. Knives were used, but they were personal tools carried by individuals, not provided at the table. Spoons existed for soups and pottages. The absence of forks and the communal nature of eating, often several people would share a bowl or trencher, meant that hand washing before and after meals was especially important and emphasized in etiquette manuals of the time. A famous medieval text on table manners advised diners to keep their fingernails clean and to avoid wiping their greasy fingers on their clothes. So you finished your small, plain breakfast. You wiped your hands on a rag, and then you went to work. Because if you did not work, you did not eat. Chapter 3. Daily Labor. Work from sunup to sundown. The medieval economy was almost entirely agricultural. The vast majority of people were peasants who worked the land, and their lives revolved around the agricultural calendar. Ploughing in autumn, sowing in late autumn and early spring, weeding and tending crops through the summer, and harvesting in late summer and early autumn. Each season brought its own back-breaking labor, and there was no such thing as a day off in the modern sense. Medieval society was structured around the manorial system, a form of feudalism that tied peasants to the land and to the lord who owned it. As a peasant, you were likely a villain or serf, which meant you were not free. You could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. You could not marry without his consent. You owed him labor, typically several days per week, and a portion of everything you produced. This was called labor service, and it was not optional. When the Lord's fields needed plowing, planting, or harvesting, you had to be there, even if your own fields were in desperate need of attention. The Lord's fields, known as the domain, were worked first. Only after his needs were met could you turn to your own strip of land, which had been allotted to you in exchange for your service. These strips of land were scattered throughout the open fields of the manor, a system that ensured fairness, but also meant that you spent a great deal of time walking from one strip to another. Your family might hold several strips in different fields, each only a few yards wide and perhaps 100 yards long. On these strips, you grew the crops that would feed your family: barley, oats, rye, peas, beans. If the harvest was good, you might have a little surplus to sell at the market. If the harvest was poor, you would go hungry. Ploughing was grueling work. A plough in the medieval period was a heavy wooden implement, often fitted with an iron blade, and it required enormous physical strength to operate. It was pulled by oxen, if you owned them, or by a team of oxen shared with other peasants. If you had no oxen, you pulled the plough yourself. You guided the plough through the soil, breaking up the earth while trying to keep the furrows straight. A day of ploughing left your muscles aching and your hands blistered and bleeding. Sowing was done by hand, scattering seed from a bag or basket as you walked up and down the field. You had to judge the spacing by eye and hope that the birds did not eat too many of the seeds before they could germinate. Once the crops were growing, they needed constant attention. Weeds had to be pulled or hoed. Fences had to be maintained to keep livestock from trampling the fields. Birds and animals had to be scared away. Harvesting was the most critical and exhausting time of the year. The entire community worked together to bring in the crops before bad weather could ruin them. Men, women, and children labored from dawn until dusk, cutting grain with sickles, curved blades with a short handle, or scythes, which were larger and more efficient but required skill to use. The cut grain was bundled into sheaves, which were then gathered and stacked to dry. After drying, the grain had to be threshed to separate the kernels from the chaff, a process that involved beating the sheaves with wooden flails or having animals trample them. Finally, the grain was winnowed by tossing it into the air so that the wind could blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier kernels fell to the ground. Every stage of the harvest was labor-intensive and time-sensitive. If it rained before the grain was gathered, the crop could rot in the fields. If a storm came during threshing, precious grain could be lost. Women and children worked as hard as men, though their tasks were often different. Women were responsible for the household, which meant far more than cooking and cleaning. They spun wool into thread, wove thread into cloth, sewed and mended clothes, brewed ale, baked bread, tended the kitchen garden, cared for chickens and pigs, milked cows, made cheese and butter, and raised children, all while also working in the fields during critical times like planting and harvest. A medieval woman's workday was never ending. Even after the sun set and the men returned from the fields, women continued working by firelight, spinning or mending. Children, as soon as they were old enough, were put to work as well. By the age of 5 or 6, a child could chase birds from the fields, gather eggs, carry water, or watch younger siblings. By 10 or 12, children were doing adult work, ploughing, harvesting, herding animals. There was no concept of childhood as a protected time of play and education. Children were small adults, expected to contribute to the family's survival. The workday was long. In the summer, when daylight lasted 15 or 16 hours, you might work 12 to 14 hours, with only a brief break at midday for a meal. In the winter, when the days were short and there was less field work to be done, you still had to care for animals, repair tools and buildings, chop and gather firewood, and prepare for the next planting season. Medieval sources suggest that peasants worked anywhere from 150 to 250 days per year, depending on the season, the demands of the Lord, and the availability of wage labor. But these figures are misleading. They count only the days spent working the Lord's fields or doing paid work. They do not count the endless hours of unpaid labor required to maintain your own household and land, hauling water, collecting firewood, cooking, cleaning, repairing, spinning, weaving, and all the other tasks that made survival possible. And after all this work, you still had to pay. You paid the Lord a portion of your harvest as rent. You paid a tithe, 10% of your produce, to the church. You paid fees for the use of the Lord's mill to grind your grain, for the use of his oven to bake your bread, for permission to gather firewood in his forests, for permission to marry, for permission to inherit land. Every major event in your life came with a cost, and every cost was paid from the meager surplus of your labor. You were trapped in a system designed to extract as much from you as possible while giving as little in return. By the time the sun set, you were exhausted, but your day was not yet over. There was still supper to be eaten, animals to be tended, and the ever-present tasks of mending and preparing for the next day. And then, finally, you could collapse onto your straw bed and sleep until you woke again in the darkness to do it all over. Chapter 4: Disease and Medicine. A world without cure. If the unrelenting labor did not kill you, disease almost certainly would. The medieval world was a paradise for pathogens and a nightmare for their human hosts. Infectious diseases ran rampant through communities, and medical knowledge was so primitive that treatments were often as deadly as the illnesses they purported to cure. The most infamous disease of the Middle Ages was, of course, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1353, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, killing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population. An estimated 25 to 50 million people. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on black rats, though recent research suggests that human parasites like lice may also have played a role in transmission. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes could grow as large as eggs or apples. turning black and oozing pus and blood. Other symptoms included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and aching limbs. The skin sometimes developed dark blotches, giving the disease its name. Most victims died within 4 to 7 days of the onset of symptoms, though some succumbed even faster. The plague came in 3 forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, attacked the lymphatic system and had a mortality rate of 30 to 75%. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs, was airborne and even deadlier, killing 90 to 95% of those who contracted it. Septicemic plague, which infected the blood, was almost always fatal, with a mortality rate approaching 100%. No one understood what caused the plague or how to stop it. Physicians, trained in the medical theories of ancient Greece and Rome, believed the disease was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, or by miasma, or bad air, corrupted by decaying matter or celestial influences. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and the application of foul-smelling poultices. Some believed that the plague was divine punishment for sin and recommended prayer, fasting, and flagellation. Others thought that looking at a plague victim could transmit the disease and urged people to avoid the sick, a strategy that at least had the effect of reducing exposure, even if the reasoning was wrong. But the Black Death was not the only scourge. Leprosy, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, dysentery, typhoid, influenza, and a host of other diseases circulated constantly. Leprosy, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, was greatly feared. It caused disfiguring sores, nerve damage, and the loss of fingers, toes, and other extremities. Lepers were often forced to live apart from society in leper colonies or hospitals and were required to carry bells or clappers to warn others of their approach. The disease was thought to be highly contagious and was associated with sin and moral corruption, though in reality it is only mildly infectious and spreads through prolonged close contact. Tuberculosis, which attacks the lungs, was endemic and deadly. It caused chronic coughing, often with blood, weight loss, fever, and eventually death. Smallpox left survivors scarred for life, if they survived at all. The disease caused high fever, severe body aches, and a rash that developed into fluid-filled pustules covering the entire body. Many victims died. Many others were left blind or disfigured. Measles, though often thought of today as a childhood disease, could be deadly, especially when coupled with malnutrition and poor living conditions. Dysentery and typhoid, spread by contaminated water and food, caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death, particularly among the very young and the very old. Influenza swept through populations in waves, sometimes killing the healthy as well as the vulnerable. Childbirth was one of the greatest dangers faced by women. It is estimated that around 20% of women died in childbirth or from complications related to pregnancy. Infections, hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, and eclampsia all claimed countless lives. Infant and child mortality was staggeringly high. Perhaps half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. If you survived childhood, your chances of reaching adulthood improved, but life expectancy remained short. For those who lived to age 21, the average life expectancy was somewhere in the mid-40s, though many died younger, and a fortunate few lived into their 60s or 70s. Medieval medicine offered little help. Physicians, who had trained at universities or under established practitioners, were rare and expensive, and their treatments were based on theories that bore little relation to reality. They believed in the 4 humours and sought to balance them through bloodletting, purging, and the administration of herbal remedies. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately draining blood from a patient, was one of the most common treatments for almost any ailment. It was thought that diseases were caused by an excess of blood or by corrupted blood, and that removing some of it would restore balance. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients and often hastened their deaths. Purging, which involved giving patients substances that induced vomiting or diarrhea, had a similar effect. Laxatives and emetics were used liberally, draining the body of fluids and nutrients at a time when rest and nourishment were desperately needed. Surgery was rudimentary and agonizing. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium, and no understanding of antisepsis. Surgical instruments were often dirty and reused without sterilization. The mortality rate from surgery was high due to infection, blood loss, and shock. Amputations were performed when a limb became gangrenous, and the stump was often cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding, a process that caused excruciating pain and sometimes led to further infection. Most people never saw a physician. Instead, they relied on folk remedies, local healers, and the advice of neighbors. Women, in particular, served as healers within their communities, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations. They brewed herbal teas, made poultices, set broken bones, assisted with childbirth, and offered comfort to the dying. The church was deeply suspicious of such women, viewing their practices as potentially heretical or magical, and many were accused of witchcraft. If you became seriously ill in the Middle Ages, your chances of recovery were slim. You would lie in your smoky, drafty home, perhaps tended by family members who did their best to ease your suffering. You might pray to God or to a saint known for healing. You might try remedies made from herbs gathered in the fields or purchased from a traveling peddler. You might be bled or purged by a barber surgeon, a tradesman who cut hair, pulled teeth, and performed minor surgeries. But more likely than not, you would die. And when you died, you would be wrapped in a simple shroud and buried in the churchyard, joining the countless others who had gone before you. Chapter 5. Crime and Punishment. Justice without mercy. Life in the Middle Ages was brutal, and so was justice. The legal system was designed not to rehabilitate or reform criminals, but to punish them swiftly and publicly, serving as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to break the law. punishments were harsh, often grotesquely so, and they were carried out in public to maximize their impact. There was no formal police force in the medieval period. Law enforcement depended on local communities, the authority of the Lord, and the vigilance of the church. If a crime occurred, it was the responsibility of the victim, their family, or the community to apprehend the offender. Sheriffs, reeves, and bailiffs acted as the Lord's representatives and had some authority to arrest criminals. But their reach was limited. In many cases, suspects were pursued by a hue and cry, in which the victim raised an alarm and all able-bodied men were obliged to join the pursuit. If the suspect escaped, the entire community could be fined for failing in its duty. Once caught, a suspect faced trial. Early in the medieval period, trials often took the form of trial by ordeal, a method rooted in the belief that God would intervene to reveal the truth. In a trial by ordeal, the accused was subjected to a painful or dangerous test. If they survived unharmed or their wounds healed cleanly, they were deemed innocent. If not, they were guilty. One common ordeal was trial by hot iron, in which the accused had to carry a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. Afterward, their hand was bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandage was removed. If the wound was healing well, the person was innocent. If it was infected or festering, they were guilty. Trial by hot water involved plunging a hand or arm into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Trial by cold water involved binding the accused and throwing them into a river or pond. If they floated, they were guilty, because the pure water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might drown in the process. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council banned clergy from participating in trials by ordeal, and the practice began to decline. It was gradually replaced by trial by jury, a system in which a group of local men were called upon to decide the guilt or innocence of the accused based on evidence and testimony. However, the early jury system was far from perfect. Juries were often biased, influenced by personal relationships, bribery, or intimidation. There were no trained lawyers or formal rules of evidence. Torture was sometimes used to extract confessions. If you refused to plead, you could be subjected to pressing, in which heavy stones were placed on your chest until you either entered a plea or died. For more serious crimes, the penalties escalated. Theft was punished by mutilation. A first-time thief might have a hand cut off. A repeat offender might lose the other hand, or be blinded, or have an ear or nose cut off. The logic was twofold. The punishment should fit the crime by depriving the thief of the means to steal again, and the mutilation should mark the criminal for life, branding them as untrustworthy in the eyes of the community. These mutilations were performed in public, often by the executioner or a local official, and they were carried out without anesthesia. The wounds were sometimes cauterized with hot iron to stop the bleeding, a process that was agonizingly painful and frequently led to infection and death. Murder, rape, treason, heresy, and other serious crimes were punishable by death, and medieval executions were designed to be as painful and terrifying as possible. Beheading was considered the most honorable method of execution and was typically reserved for the nobility. The executioner used a sword or an axe to sever the condemned person's head in a single blow, though the execution did not always go smoothly, and it sometimes required multiple strikes. For commoners, hanging was the standard method of execution. The condemned was led to a gallows, a wooden frame with a noose, and was made to stand on a cart or ladder. The noose was placed around their neck, and the cart was driven away or the ladder kicked out from under them. Death by hanging was slow and agonizing. The drop was not long enough to break the neck, so the condemned person strangled, thrashing and kicking as they fought for air. It could take many minutes to die. For particularly heinous crimes, such as treason or heresy, the punishment was even more horrific. In England, traitors were subjected to hanging, drawing and quartering. The condemned was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. Their abdomen was sliced open, and their intestines and other organs were pulled out and burned before their eyes. Finally, they were beheaded, and their body was cut into quarters, which were displayed in different parts of the kingdom as a warning. Women convicted of treason or heresy were sometimes burned at the stake. They were tied to a wooden post surrounded by bundles of wood and set on fire. Death by burning was excruciating. The heat scorched the skin and lungs, and victims often died of smoke inhalation or shock before the flames actually killed them, though this was far from guaranteed. Other forms of execution included boiling, used particularly for poisoners. The condemned was placed in a large cauldron of water or oil, which was then heated. Drowning was used in some regions. The condemned was tied and thrown into a river or lake. Breaking on the wheel, a punishment imported from the continent, involved binding the victim to a large wooden wheel and breaking their bones with a heavy iron bar. The wheel was then raised on a pole and left in a public place, with the victim dying slowly from their injuries, exposure, and dehydration. The Church had its own system of justice for religious crimes. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century to root out heresy, used torture and terror to enforce orthodoxy. Accused heretics were interrogated, often under torture, and forced to confess. Those who recanted might be sentenced to penance or imprisonment. Those who refused to recant were burned at the stake. Witchcraft, which was often conflated with heresy, was treated with similar severity. Accused witches were subjected to torture to extract confessions and were then executed, usually by burning. The stereotype of the witch hunt, though it reached its peak after the medieval period, had its roots in medieval fears of magic, demons, and the supernatural. Justice in the Middle Ages was swift, public, and merciless. It reflected a society that valued order and obedience above compassion, and that believed suffering in this life could be a deterrent to sin and a path to salvation in the next. If you committed a crime or were simply accused of one, you faced a legal system that was arbitrary, brutal, and often fatal. And if you were poor, as most people were, you had little hope of defending yourself or receiving mercy. Chapter 6. The Power of the Church: Faith, Fear, and Control. In the Middle Ages, The Catholic Church was not just a religious institution. It was the most powerful political, economic, and cultural force in Europe. The Church touched every aspect of life, from the moment you were born until the moment you were buried. It shaped your beliefs, dictated your morals, governed your behavior, and claimed a portion of your wealth. To be a Christian in medieval Europe was not optional. It was the foundation of your identity and the lens through which you understood the world. The Church's power was immense. The Pope, as the head of the Church, wielded authority that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of kings. He could excommunicate rulers, placing them outside the community of the faithful and freeing their subjects from any obligation of loyalty. He could place entire regions under interdict, suspending religious services and sacraments, a punishment that terrified populations who believed they could not enter heaven without the sacraments. The Church owned vast amounts of land, perhaps as much as 1/3 of the cultivable land in Europe, making it one of the largest landowners. Monasteries and abbeys were centers of wealth, learning, and political influence. Bishops and abbots were powerful figures, often as politically active as secular lords. For ordinary people, the Church was a constant presence. Every village had a church, usually the largest and most solid building in the community. The church was where you were baptized as an infant, where you attended Mass every Sunday and on holy days, where you confessed your sins, where you were married, and where your funeral was held before you were buried in the churchyard. The church bell marked the hours of the day and called people to prayer and to worship. The priest, though often poorly educated and sometimes corrupt, was the mediator between you and God. He alone could perform the sacraments: baptism, which cleansed you of original sin; confession, which absolved you of your personal sins; the Eucharist, in which bread and wine were transformed into the body and blood of Christ; marriage, ordination, anointing of the sick, and confirmation. Without the sacraments, you could not be saved. The Church taught that life on earth was a brief and painful trial, a testing ground for the soul. The world was a vale of tears, full of suffering, temptation, and sin. The goal of life was not happiness or prosperity, but salvation, eternal life in heaven. To achieve salvation, you had to live according to the teachings of the Church, confess your sins, receive the sacraments, and do penance for your wrongdoing. The alternative was hell, a place of eternal torment, where sinners were burned in fire, tormented by demons, and separated forever from the presence of God. The fear of hell was vivid and overwhelming. Sermons, artwork, and mystery plays depicted hell in graphic detail. Flames, sulfur, screaming souls, devils with pitchforks. For many people, the threat of hell was far more real and immediate than the promise of heaven. Between heaven and hell was purgatory, a doctrine that became increasingly important in the later Middle Ages. Purgatory was a place where souls went after death to be purified of their sins before entering heaven. The time spent in purgatory depended on the severity and number of your sins, and could be reduced through prayers, masses said on your behalf. and the purchase of indulgences, certificates issued by the Church that promised to reduce your time in purgatory or that of a deceased loved one. Indulgences became a major source of revenue for the Church, and their sale was controversial even at the time. Critics, including some within the Church, argued that they encouraged people to believe they could buy their way out of sin, undermining genuine repentance and moral behavior. The Church did not tolerate dissent. To question the teachings of the Church was heresy, and heresy was a crime punishable by death. The Inquisition, established in 1231 by Pope Gregory IX, was tasked with identifying and punishing heretics. Inquisitors traveled from town to town, interrogating suspects and using torture to extract confessions. Those found guilty of heresy were turned over to secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. The Inquisition targeted a wide range of groups: Cathars in southern France, who believed in dualism and rejected the material world; Waldensians, who preached apostolic poverty and criticized the wealth of the Church; Lollards in England, followers of John Wycliffe, who called for church reform; and later, suspected witches. Alongside official church doctrine, popular religion was full of superstition and folk belief. People believed in miracles, visions, and direct intervention by God, the Virgin Mary, or saints. Saints were venerated as intercessors, holy individuals who had lived exemplary lives and could now petition God on behalf of the faithful. Each saint was associated with particular causes or ailments. Saint Christopher protected travelers. Saint Anthony helped find lost objects. Saint Blaise cured throat ailments. Saint Sebastian protected against the plague. Pilgrimages to the shrines of saints were common. The faithful traveled, sometimes for hundreds of miles, to pray at a saint's tomb, seeking healing, forgiveness, or blessings. The most famous pilgrimage sites included Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain, but countless smaller shrines dotted the landscape. Relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, were highly prized. A church that possessed a famous relic could attract pilgrims and their donations, bringing wealth and prestige. Relics ranged from bones and hair to pieces of the true cross, thorns from Christ's crown, or vials of the Virgin Mary's milk. The authenticity of many relics was dubious, and the trade in fake relics was widespread, but the faithful rarely questioned them. To doubt a relic was to risk the wrath of God and the saint it represented. Magic and superstition coexisted uneasily with Christian teaching. Despite the Church's efforts to stamp out pre-Christian beliefs, many people continued to practice folk magic, making charms to ward off evil, casting spells to ensure good harvests or successful love affairs, consulting wise women or cunning men for herbal remedies and fortune-telling. The Church condemned such practices as superstitious and demonic, but they persisted, especially in rural areas where the reach of the clergy was limited. Belief in witches, demons, fairies, and other supernatural beings was widespread. Misfortune, illness, bad weather, failed crops, the death of livestock was often attributed to curses or the evil eye. Accused witches, usually women, were blamed for such calamities and faced persecution. Religion was not just a matter of private belief, but a communal obligation. To fail to attend Mass, to fail to pay your tithes, to fail to observe fasts and holy days was to invite censure from your neighbors and punishment from the church. Sundays and feast days were times of rest from labor, but they were also times of communal worship and social gathering. The church calendar, with its cycle of feasts, fasts, and holy days, structured the rhythm of life. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, the feasts of saints, each brought its own rituals, foods, and activities. In short, the church was inescapable. It shaped your worldview, governed your behavior, took your money, and promised you salvation or damnation depending on your obedience. To live in the Middle Ages was to live under the shadow of the church. And that shadow was long and dark. Chapter 7. Towns, Trade, and the Rise of Commerce. While most medieval people lived in rural areas, towns and cities were growing in importance, particularly in the later Middle Ages. Towns were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and commerce, and life there was both different from and yet still hard and dangerous compared to the countryside. Medieval towns were cramped, crowded, and filthy. They were surrounded by walls for defense, and the space within those walls was limited and expensive. Buildings were packed tightly together, often 3 or 4 stories tall, with upper floors jutting out over the narrow streets below, blocking sunlight and creating dark, shadowy passages. The streets themselves were unpaved, little more than dirt or cobblestone paths, and they served as open sewers. Residents threw their waste, human excrement, animal dung, rotting food, dirty water, directly into the street. Pigs, dogs, and rats scavenged through the filth. The smell was overwhelming. A mixture of sewage, rotting garbage, animal waste, and the smoke of countless hearths and workshops. Sanitation in medieval towns was primitive at best. A few cities had inherited Roman sewers, but most of these had fallen into disrepair. Instead, waste was collected in cesspits, large pits dug beneath houses or privies, which were periodically emptied by workers known as gongfamors, who hauled the contents away at night, often dumping it in rivers or on the outskirts of town. Water was drawn from wells, rivers, or public fountains, but it was frequently contaminated by sewage and industrial runoff from tanneries, dye works, and slaughterhouses. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were endemic. When the plague arrived, towns were hit harder than the countryside because of the density of the population and the ease with which disease could spread. Despite these conditions, towns were vibrant and bustling. The market square was the heart of the town, where merchants, craftsmen, and farmers gathered to buy and sell goods. On market days, the square filled with stalls and tents selling bread, cheese, meat, fish, vegetables, cloth, pottery, tools, and countless other items. The noise was constant, Vendors calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices, animals bleating and lowing, the clang of metal from nearby smithies. Markets were strictly regulated. Town officials set prices, inspected goods for quality, and enforced rules against fraud. Bakers who sold underweight loaves or brewers who watered down their ale could be fined or publicly shamed. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds, associations that controlled their respective trades. There were guilds for blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, weavers, dyers, tanners, bakers, butchers, and many other professions. Guilds regulated the quality of work, set prices, controlled entry into the trade, and provided mutual support for their members. To become a master craftsman, you had to complete an apprenticeship, often lasting 7 years, during which you lived with a master, learned the trade, and worked in exchange for food, lodging, and training. After completing your apprenticeship, you became a journeyman and worked for wages until you could afford to set up your own shop and produce a masterpiece. A piece of work judged by the guild to demonstrate your skill. Towns were also centers of learning and culture. Cathedrals, the seat of a bishop, were often located in towns, and they were not only places of worship, but also centers of administration, education, and art. Universities began to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries in cities like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. These institutions trained clergymen, lawyers, physicians, and scholars, and they became hubs of intellectual activity. However, education was limited to a small elite. Most townspeople were illiterate. Books were rare and expensive, hand-copied by scribes before the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. Towns were also politically distinct. Many towns had charters granted by the king or a powerful lord, giving them a degree of self-governance. Town councils, made up of wealthy merchants and guildmasters, managed local affairs, collected taxes, maintained fortifications, and administered justice. This relative autonomy was jealously guarded, and townspeople took pride in their freedoms, which set them apart from the serfs and peasants of the countryside. However, these freedoms were still limited, and power remained concentrated in the hands of a wealthy minority. Despite the opportunities towns offered, life there was hard. Housing was expensive and often squalid. Fire was a constant danger. Wooden buildings packed closely together could go up in flames quickly, and entire neighborhoods could be destroyed. Crime was rampant. Thieves, pickpockets, and con artists preyed on the unwary, and violent brawls were common, fueled by alcohol and disputes over money, honor, or women. Towns had night watchers and officials to maintain order, but their effectiveness was limited. Trade connected medieval towns to the wider world. Merchants traveled long distances, forming networks that stretched across Europe and beyond. Goods from the East, spices, silk, jewels, exotic foods, were brought by Italian merchants through the Mediterranean and sold at high prices. Wool from England, wine from France, timber from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, salt from the Baltic. These and countless other commodities flowed through medieval trade routes. Fairs, held annually in certain towns, attracted merchants from across Europe and were major economic events. The Champagne fairs in France were among the most famous, drawing traders from as far away as Italy, Flanders, and the Hanseatic cities of northern Germany. Yet trade was risky. Roads were poor and infested with bandits. Ships were prey to storms and pirates. Wars disrupted trade routes. The profit margins could be enormous, but so were the risks. Merchants who succeeded grew wealthy and influential, joining the ranks of the urban elite. Those who failed could be ruined. Living in a medieval town offered opportunities unavailable in the countryside, opportunities to learn a trade, to earn money, to rise in social standing. But it also brought its own hardships and dangers. Whether in town or country, life in the Middle Ages was a struggle, and survival was never guaranteed. Chapter 8: Violence, Warfare, and the Reality of Feudalism. The Middle Ages were an age of almost constant warfare. Kings fought for territory and power. Lords fought each other over land and honor. Crusaders fought to reclaim the Holy Land. Peasant revolts erupted when the oppressed could bear no more. Violence was not an aberration. It was a way of life. Feudalism, the social and political system that dominated medieval Europe, was built on the relationship between lords and vassals. At the top was the king, who granted land, called fiefs, to his most powerful nobles. These nobles, in turn, became vassals of the king, swearing oaths of loyalty and promising to provide military service. The nobles then granted portions of their land to lesser lords who became their vassals, and so on down the hierarchy. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land and owed labor and taxes to their lords. In theory, this system was mutual and reciprocal. Lords protected their vassals, and vassals served their lords. In practice, it was a system of exploitation and coercion in which the powerful extracted wealth and labor from the powerless. However, the reality of knighthood was far from the romantic ideal. Knights were warriors, and war in the Middle Ages was brutal. They fought not for glory or honor, but for land, wealth, and power. Battles were chaotic and bloody. Knights charged into combat on horseback, wielding lances, swords, maces, and battle axes. Their armor, while impressive, was heavy and restrictive. A full suit of plate armor could weigh 50 to 60 pounds. And while it provided excellent protection, it also made movement difficult and exhausting. In hot weather, knights risked heatstroke. If unhorsed, they struggled to rise and were vulnerable to foot soldiers armed with pikes, poleaxes, or daggers designed to pierce armor. Contrary to popular belief, knights were not lifted onto their horses by cranes or derricks. Such stories were satirical exaggerations from later periods. However, mounting a horse in full armor was no easy feat, and knights often needed assistance from squires. Infantry, the foot soldiers who made up the bulk of medieval armies, were often conscripted peasants armed with little more than farm implements, crude spears, or bows. They received minimal training and were sent into battle against armored knights and professional soldiers. Their mortality rates were appalling. In major battles like Agincourt, Crécy, or Towton, thousands of soldiers died in a single day. The wounded, lacking effective medical care, often succumbed to infections, blood loss, or shock. Siege warfare was even more brutal. Castles and fortified towns were besieged for weeks, months, or even years. Attackers built siege engines, trebuchets, catapults, battering rams, siege towers to breach the walls. Defenders poured boiling water, hot oil, or molten lead onto attackers. They dropped stones and shot arrows. When a siege succeeded, the victors often sacked the town, looting, burning, raping, and murdering the inhabitants. War was not just fought between armies, it devastated the civilian population. Soldiers, whether loyal to their lord or mercenaries fighting for pay, lived off the land, seizing food, livestock, and valuables from peasants. Fields were trampled or burned, villages were looted, women were raped, men who resisted were killed. The passage of an army was a catastrophe for ordinary people. Even when battles were fought far away, peasants felt the effects through increased taxes levied to pay for the war or through the loss of sons and husbands conscripted to fight. The Crusades, a series of religious wars launched by the Church to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, were among the most significant military campaigns of the Middle Ages. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and pilgrims traveled to the East, motivated by religious fervor, the promise of spiritual salvation, and the lure of wealth and adventure. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, but later crusades were less successful. The Crusades brought contact with the Islamic world and exposure to new ideas, technologies, and goods, but they also resulted in immense suffering. Christians, Muslims, and Jews were killed in horrific numbers. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 saw tens of thousands massacred. Crusaders, supposedly fighting for God, were often indistinguishable from brigands, plundering as they went. At home, violence was a regular part of life. Feuds between noble families could last for generations, fueled by insults, disputes over land, or personal grievances. Private armies of knights and men-at-arms fought each other in brutal skirmishes. The Church attempted to limit this violence through initiatives like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which prohibited fighting on certain days and protected non-combatants. But these efforts had limited success. Peasant revolts, though rare, erupted when the oppression became unbearable. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, triggered by heavy taxes and harsh laws, saw thousands of peasants march on London, demanding reforms. The revolt was crushed, and its leaders were executed. Similar uprisings occurred in France, Flanders, and elsewhere, and they were suppressed with extreme violence. For the ordinary person, the Middle Ages were a time of fear. Fear of war, fear of violence, fear of bandits and outlaws who roamed the countryside. Safety was never guaranteed, and the powerful could harm you with impunity. Justice, as we have seen, was harsh and arbitrary. Life was cheap, and death was always near. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, your place was determined by birth, and there was little chance of changing it. Society was divided into three orders, or estates: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasants and laborers. This division was seen as divinely ordained, part of God's plan for the world. To question it was to question the natural order, and to invite punishment in this life and damnation in the next. The family was the basic unit of medieval society, and it was structured around survival and labor. Marriages, especially among the peasantry, were practical arrangements rather than romantic unions. Parents often arranged marriages for their children, seeking partners who could contribute to the household economy. Love might develop over time, but it was not a prerequisite. The church required that both parties consent to the marriage, but in practice, young people, especially women, had limited autonomy in the matter. Women's roles were defined by their relationship to men, as daughters, wives, or widows. A woman's primary duty was to bear children, preferably sons who could work the land or inherit property. Childbirth, as mentioned earlier, was extremely dangerous, and many women died young as a result. Women also managed the household, which was an immense responsibility. They cooked, brewed, cleaned, spun, wove, sewed, cared for children, and worked in the fields during planting and harvest. Their labor was essential, yet it was undervalued and largely invisible in the historical record. Men, as heads of households, made the major decisions and represented the family in legal and public matters. However, medieval men, particularly peasants, had little real power or autonomy. They were bound to their lords, required to work the lord's land, and subject to the lord's authority. Any semblance of freedom was illusory. Childhood, as a concept, barely existed in the Middle Ages. Children were seen as small adults and were expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were able. By the age of 5 or 6, they performed simple tasks. By 10 or 12, they did adult work. There was no formal schooling for the vast majority of children. Literacy was confined to the clergy, the nobility, and a small urban elite. Peasant children learned by doing, acquiring skills from their parents and neighbors. Infant and child mortality was staggeringly high, as noted earlier. Roughly half of children died before the age of 5, from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or neglect. Parents could not afford to become too attached to their young children, knowing that death was likely. Some historians have argued that this led to a certain emotional distance, though this view is contested. Evidence from letters, wills, and chronicles suggests that parents did grieve deeply for lost children, even if they outwardly accepted such deaths as God's will. For those who survived, childhood was short. Girls might be married as young as 12 or 13, though 14 or 15 was more common. Boys took on adult responsibilities at a similar age. Apprenticeships, for those learning a trade, often began around age 12 and lasted 7 years. The young apprentice lived with the master craftsman, learning the trade and working in exchange for room, board, and training. Social mobility was extremely limited. A peasant could not become a knight, nor a craftsman a nobleman. There were a few exceptions. A particularly talented cleric might rise through the church hierarchy, or a wealthy merchant might purchase a title, but such cases were rare. Most people lived and died in the same social class into which they had been born. The elderly, if they lived long enough to become elderly, were often cared for by their families, though this was a burden that strained already limited resources. There were no pensions, no social safety nets. The old worked as long as they were able and depended on the charity of their children or the church when they could no longer support themselves. The church operated hospitals and almshouses that provided care for the poor, the sick, and the aged. But these institutions were underfunded and overcrowded. Widows occupied a particularly precarious position. A woman who lost her husband might lose her home, her land, and her livelihood if she had no sons to support her or no dowry to fall back on. Some widows remarried quickly out of necessity. Others were reduced to begging or dependent on the charity of the church. A few managed to run their late husband's businesses or farms, but this required exceptional skill and determination. Chapter 10: Death, Burial, and the Afterlife. Death was ever present in the Middle Ages. It came suddenly, often without warning, and it came for everyone: infants, children, young adults, the elderly. There was no escaping it, and medieval people knew this. Death shaped their worldview, their beliefs, and their daily practices. The ars moriendi, or art of dying, was a major theme in medieval culture, and people were encouraged to live in constant awareness of their mortality and to prepare for death with confession, penance, and prayer. When death approached, whether from illness, injury, or old age, the family and community gathered. The local priest was summoned to administer the last rites, a sacrament also known as extreme unction or anointing of the sick. The priest heard the dying person's final confession, absolved them of their sins, and anointed them with holy oil. This ritual was believed to prepare the soul for its journey into the afterlife and to ease the transition from this world to the next. To die without the last rites was considered a tragedy, for it meant the soul might not be ready to face judgment. After death, the body was washed and wrapped in a simple linen shroud. Embalming was not practiced except for royalty or the very wealthy. The body was usually buried within a day or two, as there was no way to preserve it. The burial took place in the churchyard, the cemetery adjacent to the parish church. Graves were often shallow and unmarked. Over time, as the churchyard filled, older graves were disturbed, and bones were moved to a charnel house, a building or crypt where skeletal remains were stored. Funerals varied depending on the social status of the deceased. A wealthy lord might have a grand funeral with elaborate ceremonies, a procession, and the endowment of masses to be said for the repose of his soul. A peasant's funeral was much simpler: a brief service, a burial in the churchyard, and prayers said by family and neighbors. The church charged fees for funerals and burials, and these fees could be burdensome for poor families. The afterlife was vividly imagined in medieval thought. The soul, upon leaving the body, faced judgment. The righteous went to heaven, a paradise of light, joy, and eternal communion with God. The wicked went to hell, a place of fire, torment, and eternal separation from God. But for most people, who were neither saints nor monsters, there was purgatory, a place of temporary suffering where souls were purified of their sins before entering heaven. The time spent in purgatory could be reduced through prayers, masses, and acts of charity performed by the living on behalf of the dead. This belief in purgatory created a complex economy of intercession. The living prayed for the dead, and the dead were believed to pray for the living. Families paid priests to say masses for deceased relatives. Wealthy individuals left money in their wills to fund perpetual masses. The fear of hell was a powerful motivator for moral behavior. Hell was depicted in sermons, paintings, and sculptures with terrifying detail. Demons tormented sinners. Fire consumed them. They were frozen, flayed, boiled, torn apart. Punishments that were endless and inescapable. The 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, were catalogued and condemned, and each was associated with specific torments in hell. The Church used the fear of hell to enforce obedience and to extract money through the sale of indulgences. Mass death events, such as the Black Death, transformed attitudes toward death and the afterlife. The sheer scale of the mortality, up to 60% of the population in some regions, overwhelmed communities. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug, and the dead were interred without ceremony. The survivors were traumatized, and the cultural expression of this trauma can be seen in the art and literature of the later Middle Ages. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, depicting skeletons dancing with people of all social classes, from kings to peasants, reminding everyone of the universality of death. The memento mori, or remember you must die, was a common theme. Skulls, bones, and images of decay appeared frequently in art, serving as reminders of mortality and the need to prepare for death. Yet the acceptance of death did not mean that it was not feared or mourned. Chronicles, letters, and poetry revealed the deep grief that people felt when they lost loved ones. Parents mourned their children. Spouses mourned each other. Friends mourned friends. But mourning was tempered by the belief that death was not the end. The soul lived on, and the faithful would be reunited in heaven. This belief provided comfort, even as it imposed the burden of ensuring that the dead were properly remembered and prayed for. In death, as in life, the inequality of medieval society was stark. The wealthy could afford grand tombs, effigies, and endowed masses. The poor were buried in unmarked graves and forgotten. The Church promised salvation to all who believed and followed its teachings. But the reality was that wealth brought advantages even in the afterlife. Chapter 11. Why You Would Not Survive. We have walked through a single day in the Middle Ages, from the moment of waking to the moment of burial. And by now, the answer to the question posed at the beginning, why you would not last a day, should be clear. You would not survive because the physical demands alone would break you. The labor required to farm the land, to haul water, to chop wood, to cook over an open fire, to spin and weave and sew, all without the aid of modern tools or machines, was exhausting, and it was unending. There were no weekends, no vacations, no retirement. You worked until you could work no more, and then you died. You would not survive because of the dirt and disease, the lack of sanitation, the contaminated water, the vermin, the crowded and filthy living conditions. All of these created a breeding ground for illness. And once you became ill, there was little that could be done to help you. Medical knowledge was primitive. Treatments were often harmful, and infection was almost always fatal. The life expectancy was short, and the leading causes of death, infectious disease, malnutrition, injury, childbirth, were ever present. You would not survive because of the hunger. Food was scarce and monotonous. Famines were common. You might go to bed hungry more nights than not. Malnutrition weakened your body and made you vulnerable to disease. Watching your children starve would break your heart, but there would be nothing you could do. You would not survive because of the violence. Whether from war, crime, or the brutal punishments meted out by the authorities, violence was a constant threat. You could be conscripted to fight in a war you did not understand, killed by bandits on the road, or executed for a crime you did not commit. The powerful could harm you with impunity, and there was no recourse. You would not survive because of the oppression. You were bound to the land, subject to the Lord's authority, and obligated to the church. You had no freedom, no rights, no voice. The system was designed to exploit you, to extract your labor and your wealth for the benefit of those above you. You could not escape it, and any attempt to resist would be met with violence. You would not survive because of the fear. Fear of God, fear of hell, fear of sin, fear of demons, fear of disease, fear of starvation, fear of violence. Fear shaped every aspect of life, and there was no relief from it. And yet, for all of this, medieval people did survive. They endured these hardships for generations, finding moments of joy, love, and beauty in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. They sang songs, told stories, celebrated festivals, raised families, and built communities. They created magnificent art, architecture, literature, and music, much of which survives today. They were not merely victims of their time, but active participants in their world, resilient and resourceful in the face of overwhelming challenges. If you had been transported back to the Middle Ages, you would almost certainly not have lasted a day. But the people who did live through those times, who endured and persevered, deserve our respect and our remembrance. Their struggles shaped the world we live in today. Their resilience reminds us of the strength of the human spirit. And their story, dark and difficult as it is part of our shared history. A history that we must never forget. Conclusion. Reflections on a distant world. As we close this journey through medieval life, take a moment to appreciate the warmth of your home, the safety of your bed, the abundance of your kitchen. Appreciate the medicine that cures your illnesses, the clean water that flows from your tap, the freedom you have to choose your path in life. These are not small things. They are miracles, hard-won over centuries of struggle, innovation, and reform. The Middle Ages were a time of great darkness, but also of great resilience. They were a time when life was cheap and death was common, but also when communities came together to support each other. When faith provided hope in the face of despair, and when people found ways to create beauty and meaning in a harsh world. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. We can remember the suffering and injustice of earlier times, and we can strive to ensure that such suffering is not repeated. We can honor the memory of those who came before us by building a world that is more just, more compassionate, and more humane. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the medieval peasant waking in the darkness, facing another day of toil and uncertainty. Remember their struggles, their fears, their small joys, and be grateful for the world we live in today. A world that, for all its flaws, is immeasurably better than the one they knew. Sleep well. And thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories to tell, many more worlds to explore. Until next time, rest easy and dream of a world that is kinder than the one we have just left behind.